Beautiful like a fresco and fascinating for its idiosyncrasies, Street Fighter III Third Strike is a melting pot of both popular culture and fighting game design. This is the Annotated Third Strike.
Welcome to the world of Street Fighter III. Prepare for battle. Yeah, I've been waiting for this. Well, I got the picture.
There are gods and there are children. On the one side, Street Fighter III Third Strike is a game of and for the old. Blatantly made for a hardcore set of players honing their skills in the crucible of challenging systems and arcane untold mechanics, it's earned a reputation, perhaps deservedly, for being unkind to genre neophytes. To carve it into a metaphor, it's also the playground of deities. Competitors that have trained themselves to bend these experiences to their will find themselves in a thematic divine company. Christian-like Gil, Greek-like Urian, the Buddhist forms of Akuma and Oro, the ascendants of new powers such as Alex if Gil has his way. On the other hand, Third Strike is a garden of youth. Makoto, Ibuki, and Elena are all high school students. Sean's at university. Yun and Yang were designed to be popular for younger players. Effie, a side character, barely looks old enough to drive. Parental figures like Ken and Chun-Li steward and grow the children in their care. If we're wringing a metaphor out of this, too, it's one solution to the most challenging fighting game dilemma. Namely, how do you attract and teach new players when the old guard rule the game? The answer is the young. Let them ask new questions and find new answers. Teach them the concepts and fundamentals and let them run free. Encourage and build a literal new generation. Somewhere in the middle, immovable as a mountain, is Ryu. There is always Ryu. As a piece of design, Ryu is the baseline, the center point to build a game around. As meta theory, though, Ryu is larger than that. The eternal wanderer overcoming both internal and external hardship to grow, to evolve, to understand, Ryu is the player. He's the competitor, both the trainee and the champion. We could point to countless examples of how the narrative hooks of the game, such as they are, revolve around this character's motivations for a lifelong journey to train, and the awe it inspires throughout the cast and the overall series, as simply metaphors for a person willing to enjoy this kind of game on any competitive level. The player picks up the game, they learn the basics and hone them, they push themselves to find new challenges. They learn from their mistakes, they win, they lose, they do it again. At its most elemental, that is Ryu. Ryu's motivations are well documented in both official materials for the series as well as fan canon. Ryu cares only for the fight, but not fighting for its own sake. He's an eternal student, a stoic man pushing himself to grow and evolve toward a singular goal that, in practicality, does not exist. Various media over the years have called this endgame various things. Master of the Fist, a true martial artist, the path of the warrior. But the final result is always the same, unattainable. Fighting games, and specifically Third Strike, are no different. Even the best players on the planet can't, say, parry every incoming attack and counter it, meaning a theoretical skill ceiling for the game will likely never be found. There's always something to practice, to hone. Ryu represents this. The path to creating him, and then refining what we see as Ryu, was iterative and complex, and not from the people most closely associated with making the franchise. Other than, of course, the father of the Street Fighter series and one of the key minds behind the dawn of competitive fighting games, Takashi Nishiyama. Co-designer of the original Street Fighter in 1987, Nishiyama began his career at arcade developer Irem in the early 1980s, where he made Spartan X, known in the West as Kung Fu Master or simply Kung Fu for the NES, a martial arts action game based loosely around the Jackie Chan film of the same name, also known as Wheels on Meals. The game also sprouts from the 1978 Bruce Lee film Game of Death, a treatise on the film star's fighting philosophy before his sudden passing, leaving the studio to bastardize the film for eventual release. The game's level-ending boss fights are embryonic examples of 2D fighting game design as the protagonist faces off with enemies of varying abilities. Capcom poached Nishiyama from Irem, where he refined Spartan X's design in the arcade game Trojan, along with its NES port, both in 1986. By this point, other developers like Technos Japan had begun to splinter out Spartan X design and forming what we now consider the beat-em-up genre, with games like the Kunio-kun series or Renegade and eventual Double Dragon games, as well as Karate Do, known as Karate Champ in the West, what many consider the first competitive fighting game. Nishiyama, however, would swerve away from side-scrolling and belt-scrolling games for a top-down view for Trojan's follow-up, Avengers, starring a young street tough named Ryu. His next game was the original Street Fighter in 1987. From what we know of Street Fighter's design, as told in an oral history on the subject on enthusiast website Polygon, it can be viewed as a culmination of Nishiyama's career to that point and the direction he wanted to push the nascent fighting genre. In the oral history, he makes clear that the boss fights in Spartan X were the jumping off point for Street Fighter's ultimate planning, and not other early one-on-one fighting games like Karate Champ or Konami's YR Kung Fu, both released in arcades in 1984, as many like to speculate. The influences of these games are certainly in Street Fighter, though, as we've discussed in Chun-Li's episode in this series, and the overall structure of how Street Fighter is played and progresses. Nishiyama was clear in the oral history, too, that his game needed story, though very little is experienced in-game, which is where our discussion of Ryu himself will take shape. Story in any given arcade game up to this point, and shortly beyond, were only given in two sections: the attract mode that repeats before a player plops in a coin to play, and then the ending of the game if one even existed at the time. The original Street Fighter had practically neither. What Capcom did have, though, was a talented art staff and relationships with a contemporary games press, where it could publish various pieces of ephemera, like the original arcade flyer for the game detailing Ryu, Ken, and their opponents' limited backstory. As translated by Twitter user Archound, it's here that we have several kernels of what would later define the series' lore, including the first mention of a fictional Assassin's Fist martial arts system, which is incidentally attributed again in this game, as well as hints at Ken's familial heritage and the fact that Ryu, with his shock of red hair and comfy slippers, is described as a fighting genius learned in several styles. To trainees of real-world martial arts, this should sound familiar. Cho Young-yi was born in what we now refer to as the Gimjae, North Jeol Province, South Korea, in 1923. Living on his sister's farm in Japanese-controlled Manchuria in his early years, he met a farmhand that taught him Chinese martial arts at the age of 9 and found that he was more than adept. Immigrating to Japan in the 1930s to join the Japanese Army's aviation school, Cho began the process of citizenship and changed his name to Masutatsu Oyama. There, he began training in judo forms and eventually moved on to Shotokan karate under the direction of Gigo Funakoshi, son of the form's founder Gichin. Oyama became ravenous, training in different fighting forms and moving on when he found that he had mastered them. With the help of sponsors, he moved to the mountains at various points with either a small set of students or completely alone to train and develop what became his own style. In 1953, he opened his first school, the Oyama Dojo, which was an offshoot of Goju-Ryu karate, but traveled both Japan and the world giving demonstrations of not only the limits of karate as a system, but his own strength as a devotee. From here, the myth of this fighting genius began to form. In 1957, Oyama and his top students formally changed the name of his style to Kyokushin, or Ultimate Truth, where it remained the largest formalized martial arts system in the world under the direction of a single man, Oyama himself, until his death in 1994. By the 1970s, Oyama became something of a folk hero. Tall tales of fighting bears in the wilderness, knocking out a bull with a single punch, and training his punch and kicks beneath flowing waterfalls became ingrained in popular culture thanks to martial arts film legend Sonny Chiba portraying the man in movies about his life, which he even appeared in himself. In fact, a story published on popular culture site IGN in 2009 postulates that Street Fighter was named after Chiba's own 1974 classic, Clash Killer Fist, renamed Street Fighter for Western release. Without getting too far ahead of ourselves, these feats also seeped into video game culture as they became part of Zangief's backstory, a bonus stage in Karate Champ, and parts of both Ryu and Sagat's training in various Street Fighter endings. Though the, quote, wandering samurai is a stock Japanese narrative, modern fiction about a man roaming from place to place to perfect himself is often an iteration on Oyama and his ever-growing legend, now even more so 30 years after his death. It is no exaggeration to say that if you enjoy video games with Japanese martial arts as a focus, from Karate Champ to Street Fighter to Tekken and far beyond, you are experiencing the influence of Masutatsu Oyama, his pupils, and his teaching. Certainly, the grand myth of Oyama wasn't confined to the massive tournaments he founded in Japan and the fawning film industry. Lionized in Japanese manga as well, Oyama's travels were also fictionalized in Karate Baka Ichidai, serialized between 1971 and 1977 in Weekly Shonen magazine, written by Iki Kajiwara and illustrated by Jiro Tsunoda and Joya Kagemura. Kajiwara is a figure that viewers of this series should recognize, as his work shaped the identity of Ryu's rival Ken with Shikakui Jungle, and much of what I later found to be Street Fighter III's Dudley with Ashitano no Jo. Karate Baka Ichidai was particularly influential on former Capcom artist turned eventual executive Keiji Inafune, as he cribbed much of it for the designs of characters in the first Street Fighter game, some more recognizable than others. What is certainly recognizable to fans of Japanese media is the character archetype that Ryu represents, that of the lone wanderer. Though not exclusive to the region, as many countries have their share of silent gunslingers and swordsmen for hire, fans of film, manga, and games often cite this trope as something born from the stories of Ronin, a drifting, masterless samurai of Japan's feudal age. Thus, many see this as a distinctly Japanese character type, though this is certainly debatable. In naming him Ryu, though, Nishiyama does establish a certain nationalism. Ryu is a somewhat common male name that translates to dragon, a creature often feared in Western myth as a terrifying giant, but revered in many Asian cultures as noble and often divine. It can also mean school or group, such as being part of the Kyokushin Ryu, School of Karate. Like his friend and rival Ken, it's a fitting name with many meanings. As for the first Street Fighter itself, Ryu has no dialogue to speak of, and the only narrative that we can see are the same ramblings of each finished opponent before a final scrawl that he will be challenged again. Aficionados of the series, however, know that this wasn't how Capcom left it by the time Street Fighter II was released. In a fit of retconned lore, Ryu's final confrontation with final boss Sagat had him losing the fight, but throwing out a desperate Shoryuken to end the bout, horrifically scarring the Emperor of Muay Thai across the torso. While this hook eventually turned the towering Thai boxer into the franchise's noble adversary trope, Capcom eventually found this to be an inflection moment in the grander Ryu narrative. In the manga adaptation of Street Fighter Zero by Masahiko Nakahira, Ryu laments his win over Sagat, knowing that something dark and terrible had come over him to lash out in such a way. The comics eventually even gave this a name, the Satsui no Hado, or sometimes Dark Hado, a feeling that would overcome Ryu's calm, stoic self and make him vengeful, cruel, and aggressive. As Nakahira's work was released by Shinseisha concurrent with Street Fighter Zero's release in Japan, Capcom, as it is wont to do, released an update to the Street Fighter Zero 2 arcade board to reflect this by adding in Evil Ryu, an adjusted version of the franchise lead character with abilities cribbed from Akuma, such as the Shungokusatsu. The Zero or Alpha games in the West also expand Ryu's relationship with Akuma as seen in the endings for Zero, 2, and 3. In it, Capcom runs with the Satsui no Hado side of Ryu to form Akuma into something of a Faustian devil to tempt Ryu into embracing his darker side. And this effectively formed Ryu's story in the games, comics, and related media through today, as Evil Ryu still exists as of this video up to and including Kage in Street Fighter V. However, also of this production, Third Strike is the end of the franchise timeline until the eventual release of Street Fighter VI. Not only are the various plot points of early games, including the Dictator and the rivalry with Sagat, things of the past, so too are Ryu's struggles with his inner self. In Akuma's Second Impact rival dialogue, Ryu mentions that murderous intent, a translation of Satsui no Hado, was never the real way of the warrior, implying that he made peace with his inner demons and found that the calm, peaceful path to strength was the right one, at least for him. This, at least, is a narrative reason why there's no Evil Ryu in Street Fighter III. And while his endings in both Second Impact and Third Strike double down on his more staid representations throughout the series, as he philosophizes over the path he has chosen and the lengths he must travel to reach it, the Third Strike ending is a direct reference to Ryu Final, the manga also by Nakahira, which is a very loose adaptation of the Street Fighter III series that ultimately concludes the Ryu-Akuma conflict. Yet another example of Capcom reading the related work that their franchise had birthed and adopting it into the series proper. You could say that this is also true for even minor bits of the character, such as the duffel bag that he drops to the ground in match intros. We first see this as Ryu accessory in the manga Street Fighter II Ryu by Masami Kanzaki in 1993 and has been a staple design piece ever since. More granular to the Street Fighter III games themselves, an interview on the Capcom Fighters Network page with producer Tomoshi Sadamoto solidified long-held fan rumors that Ryu was the only returning character from the overall franchise planned to be included in Street Fighter III. Capcom artist and designer Akira Akiman Yasuda corroborates this in the oral history of the Street Fighter III games, also on Polygon, stating that it was his idea to add the series' main character after development had been flailing directionless for some time. This gives us some fun room to speculate about the construction of a fighting game. Though Nishiyama stated that he wanted more characters to be playable in the first Street Fighter, it's certainly designed around Ryu, and by proxy Ken, since the player generally has the upper hand on AI opponents due to the inclusion of special moves. That is, until another player ponies up to the machine for competitive play, where it's two players against each other with the exact same moveset. Since Ryu and Ken were the only two characters returning in playable form for Street Fighter II World Warrior in 1991, it's likely they were also used as the starting point for designing the rest of the roster around them. At EVO 2015, former Capcom producer Peter Combofin Rosas held a panel discussing Street Fighter V's design philosophies ahead of launch and stated that Ryu was, quote, the standard, a character which anyone can pick up and play. Using him teaches the fundamentals of Street Fighter. While Rosas was discussing Street Fighter V specifically, it's likely that all games in the franchise are basically built around this character and his tools. Except, perhaps, the Street Fighter III games. Well, this is speculation on my part, knowing that Ryu and Ken were included into the game at a later stage, and likely after initial plans for the parry system were formulated, one wonders if New Generation was designed around a different character, maybe Alex given his main protagonist status. The design team hasn't stated as such, but it would make a lot of sense given the relative weakness of the projectile game, something of paramount importance to the Street Fighter II series, and what most Ryus are built around in the games in which he appears. As the oldest of the legacy characters, Ryu has had many voice actors over the years. We still don't have any clear answers as to who originally lent their voice for the first game in the series, but it's likely one of the design team pitching in. This was common practice at the time, and one that stretched through the development of World Warrior, where the graphic designers all lent a hand for various voices in the games, according to VG Densetsu, including the designers for both Guile and Boxer splitting voice duties for Ryu and Ken, who share the same voiceover in that game. Veteran game and anime actor Katashi Ishizuka then picked up the character in 1995 with the release of the first Street Fighter Zero game, and held on to the role through all of Street Fighter Zero, EX, and the crossover games through Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in 2000. Wataru Tagaki then voiced Ryu in New Generation and Second Impact along with Yang, in whose episode Tagaki was already mentioned. Ryu's appearance in Third Strike is the only time Toru Okawa voiced the character. Under the longtime anime and game seiyuu, Okawa would later lend his voice talents to Gouken in the Street Fighter IV games and that character's brief appearance in Street Fighter V. Actor Hiroki Takahashi has had the role ever since. In what we can only really describe as a moment of levity, Ryu and Ken's stage in New Generation is an onsen town. These are natural hot springs caused by volcanic activity and often have traditional inns or whole resorts built around them in Japan. This particular onsen shows us the town first and then the actual hot spring when the locations change between rounds. Look closely and you can see a few familiar faces bathing high in the background, like a pre-Third Strike Chun-Li, Felicia from the Darkstalker series, and a very rare cross-game appearance by Aliens vs. Predator protagonist Lin Kurosawa, all of which were confirmed in the New Generation Gamist movie. Though his home stage in the first Street Fighter Zero game takes place on a normal street corner, normally, as fans of the franchise well know, Ryu can be found in his childhood training grounds at Suzaku Castle. His entry in Series Bible Eternal Challenge states that he returns here once a year to honor the grave of his teacher and de facto father, Gouken, who was murdered by Akuma before the events of the Street Fighter Zero games. He returns here for an after-lunch match in Third Strike as the opponent select screen tells us it takes place at the oddly specific 1:33 p.m. This is a different end of the castle than what we normally see in games like the Street Fighter II series and even Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, with its breakable sign on the far ends of the arena, whose writing bear the same kanji that often appear on Ryu's obi in various illustrations dating back to the Street Fighter II's release. It translates into Wind, Forest, Fire, Mountain, but is an abbreviation as, quote, swift as wind, as silent as forest, as fierce as fire, as unshakable as a mountain. This phrase is known as the Furin Kazan, which is a reference to Sun Tzu's Art of War, which the Takeda clan emblazoned on their standards during the Sengoku period of feudal Japan. As a character in the game, the years of training have paid off for the man. Never counted out in tournaments, Ryu has become a controversial figure in Third Strike's continued life since its release, and his inclusion on fan-made tier lists has fluctuated over the years from middle of the pack to theoretical king of the jungle. This is due largely to the evolving competitive scene of the game and the use of, yes, a specific super art, Denshin Hadoken, which we'll detail in a moment. In Third Strike circles, a Denshin Ryu can take just as much flack as Yun with his Genei-Gen for being an unfair tool, which makes opinions about how good the character really is compared to the rest of the cast vary wildly. The truth, though, is that not only does Ryu in Third Strike hit like a truck, all three of his super arts are viable choices in tournament play. Some are simply more commonly employed than others. In terms of raw gameplay, he's more akin to Akuma than Ken with his normal moveset. His stun-heavy overhead punch with toward and medium punch and solar plexus punch with toward hard punch along for the ride, as well as the two-hit jumping medium punch. These three moves debuted in Super Street Fighter II Turbo in 1994. Curiously, the jumping medium punch does not combo into supers in this game as it does in every other Street Fighter game in which it appears. This is largely due to the second hit maxing out the hidden juggle counter running in the background. His taunt is interesting in that it makes his stun meter deplete faster than normal. More interesting is that it, as well as Akuma's taunts and wind poses, are references to this piece of Akiman art made for Street Fighter II's release on the Super Famicom. He has a target combo with far-standing hard punch and hard kick, but the spacing is so specific for landing both hits that it's not often seen in tournament play, and it's maybe one of the worst in the game. Of course, the 3 iconic special moves appear as planned, but that doesn't mean there's nothing to say about them. The Hadouken, perhaps his most famous move, changed subtly though impactfully over time. A fan of science fiction Ananime Nishiyama included the move into the first Street Fighter as a reference to the classic space battleship Yamato, or Star Blazers in the West, which ran on Japanese television beginning in 1974. The titular Yamato had a giant cannon called a Hadoho, or wave motion gun. As Hadouken translates into wave motion fist, this is likely the reason we can see Ryu and Ken's hands in the sprite of the fireball, but not, however, for every game. Super Street Fighter II in 1993 introduced a new Hadouken sprite that made it more of a ball of plasma. This lasted through the Zero Alpha games, but went back to having his hand seen in the projectile for the Street Fighter III games and beyond. The strength of the button dictates the speed of the fireball, but the EX variation hits twice, will knock down, and has some juggle capability if only one hit lands, making it a very versatile move and one of the best projectiles in the game. Its name in this state changes to the Shakunetsu Hadouken, which we can hear Ryu yell when he throws it, which is unique in this game for being the only EX move that is called out by name. It translates into Red Hot Motion Wave Fist. It's also a reference to the fact that in the Street Fighter II games there was a 1 in 256 chance that the Hadouken would come out as red as opposed to the usual blue. Well, this sent the pre-internet fandom into a whirl wondering what it meant if this special red fireball was stronger. Street Fighter II designer Akira Nishitani took to Twitter in 2013 to clear the air, and that it wasn't a bug or anything game-breaking, just a programmer having a bit of whimsy. The Tatsumaki Senpu Kyaku, or Cyclone Hurricane Kick, is a one-hit knockdown, which differs from both Ken and Akuma's usage of the move. It floats through many projectiles and a common combo ender, the strength of the button used to dictate the distance traveled and the damage inflicted. The EX version is also interesting in that it's essentially Ryu's Shinku Tatsumaki, or Vacuum Hurricane Kick, a super from the Street Fighter Zero games. It hits 5 times, is a good tool to chip out an opponent at the end of a round, but also has some juggle usage as well. It can be performed in the air like other Tatsus, as well as the EX variation, which can be used occasionally to get him out of trouble. The Shoryuken, or Rising Dragon Fist, is the classic uppercut, with the strength of the button determining power and height. The EX version is stronger in that it will hit twice. In this game, the safest usage of this move is as a combo ender, since Ryu's DP, powerful as it is, tends to be a gamble when used as an anti-air move. This Dragon Punch was toned down from Second Impact in that it was a 2-hit move outside of EX in that game, which, as we've discussed in both the Perry episode of the series as well as Ken's, would have ultimately made this attack better for the Street Fighter III games. New to this series of games is the Jodan Sokotogiri, or Upper Sword Leg Kick. Commonly referred to as the Mule or Donkey Kick by the Ryu faithful, this was something of a strange inclusion when it debuted in New Generation in 1997. Essentially, another combo-ending attack is a block Donkey Kick. Damaging as it may be, is very unsafe. Its main use was to send opponents flying so Ryu could continue a fireball heavy zoning game, which the parry system essentially nullifies. The introduction of EX moves in Second Impact altered its use though. Not only does it add further muscle to the attack, it's the last move in the game that we'll see that bounces an opponent off a wall for a follow-up attack. Depending on the situation, this could mean an easy way to force opponents into the corner or readjust the neutral game to the mid-screen as the need dictates. Since Ken wasn't bestowed an extra special move to the Street Fighter III games, you may wonder why they had to give one to Ryu, essentially fixing something that wasn't broken. The answer may be something that had been bubbling up from the beginning of the series. In the code for the first Street Fighter in 1987, and also found in early prototypes of the game, is a Fire Kick sprite in Ryu's graphic tiles. While cut from the game, official art for both the arcade cabinet and the PC home release of Street Fighter illustrates him using the move all the same. The Mule Kick may be an evolution of this unused concept. But the design ethos of Ryu, and basically fighting games in general, has always been easy to learn, difficult to master. Which is why all of these moves work so well in concert with each other, even if it's just ending combos or hopefully not being parried when you uppercut a jumping opponent. All of these are easily comboed from normal moves, and since he hits so hard in this game, aren't reliant on long complex strings of attacks to be effective, unlike other cast members' toolsets. Ryu is a character that makes good use and can reap high damage out of both normal specials and EX moves, which makes him a very versatile character that doesn't excel in one particular facet of the game. But no, that's a lie. In no other Street Fighter game but this one, Ryu is the master of one thing: fear. As mentioned, Ryu is a character with 3 good options for super arts in Street Fighter III, which puts him in very small company. Many players, though, and as time has marched on, many more will attest that one stands head and shoulders above the rest for the anxiety it causes alone, the Denjin Hadoken, or Electric Blade Wave Motion Fist. This is a very specific move to these very specific games. Not highly damaging on its own, Ryu will charge a fireball as the player holds down a punch button to throw the attack when they choose within a specific time limit. The benefit, though, is that the Denjin is made to stun an opponent, and a fully charged Denjin will stun any character in the game. The twist is that it cannot be blocked, only parried, making it take full advantage of not only that particular aspect of Third Strike, but also the under-the-hood mechanics that the Street Fighter games possess. This simply is a terrifying tool. Not knowing the exact timing of when a Ryu throws the Denjin means sets against this character wind up as a series of coin tosses. Even as a 3-hit combo from Ryu can mean 40% of an opponent's health, a free combo from stun often means the round is over. As an opponent must at least be capable of parrying multiple attacks to begin with, the bar for fighting a practiced Ryu is set very high, and worse if they employ any series of Denjin traps. These illustrate two more unadvertised rules of the Street Fighter III games. First, fireballs in this game can be whiffed into supers, meaning that the most common Denjin trap of a fireball into super means that most on the receiving end must often red parry the Denjin and add a challenge, or be subjected to full stun. The second is that special moves can also combo into super arts. In Ryu's case, this could mean a DP that lands on a rival will pop them into the air with enough time to fully charge an engine, where it's then all a matter of time as to when to pitch the baseball. As second impact added the ability to rotate the arcade stick to more quickly charge the attack, something that carried into Third Strike, taking a big guess from an uppercut could mean an opponent KO. Ironically, this move was meant to be played against beginners. In Sadamoto's CFN interview, he states that certain super arts were placed into the game as handicaps for more seasoned players. Second Impact adjusted it to be a competitive monster though, by giving him 2 stocks of the super so he had added EX to play with. This was adjusted down for Third Strike to only one single short meter, but the ability to quickly charge the move depending on the speed of the stick rotation meant the genie was out of the bottle, and a Denjin Ryu player will find themselves subject to their share of sneers and side-eyes for every tournament they enter. But again, they don't need this move to make Ryu a threat. Super Art 1 is the Shinku or Vacuum Hadoken, which is a 5-hit super fireball. Essentially the same as Akuma Super 1, but better, it gives Ryu 2 stocks of medium bar to play with, which means he can have plenty of EX moves to throw around, as well as the super if the opportunity arises. As Ryu has some of the best EX moves in the game, this makes it his utility super, and one that some Ryu players choose as EX ammo only while ignoring the burst damage of the Shinku. He also recovers faster out of this move than Akuma, meaning he can follow it with attacks that either knock down or reset opponents in the corner. Given the Vortex his stun-heavy overhead moves give him, Ryu is scary even without the Denjin in many corner situations. This was his first ever super move, dating back to Super Turbo in 1994. On the surface, a basic option, but a fantastic choice for beginners and pros alike. Finally, there's the Shin, or True Shoryuken. One of the more devastating moves in the game, this attack came directly from Sadamoto's ruminations on giving players a choice of supers before the match begins. I personally thought of Ryu as the Shoryuken character, but it seems the world thinks of Ryu as the Hadoken character, he says, which means the super gives us the best of both worlds. This is basically 2 moves in one. If a player jumps at Ryu, using this as an anti-air will cause a sequence of 7 hits. More damaging though is applying it in its raw form or in a combo on the ground, where the animation changes to a 4-hit meltdown of opponent health. And more since Ryu can follow up the super with another attack. This has become a Ryu staple maneuver in the games that followed, being assumed in the Street Fighter Zero games with number 3 in 1998, and then the Versus games shortly thereafter. If he doesn't have it in initial releases, EX versions of the SRK emulate the movement in Street Fighter 4 and 5, until the Shin SRK was officially added to those games later. When asked about the move in Street Fighter 25, The Art of Street Fighter, Third Strike designer Hidetoshi Nyoji Ishizawa likens the sound effect used for when an opponent blocks the Shin Shoryu to the sound of metal being hit, like fighting Dural in Virtual Fighter, which was popular in his social circles at the time, he said, and what may be an unintended influence on Third Strike. This sound effect, incidentally, is the same as when Urian's metal body blocks attacks. This is the least common choice seen in high-level tournaments, but it's still a good option given the damage output. But like fighting games as a whole, that is Ryu. Straightforward on the surface with layers of complexity baked within. While not often found in tier list debates, some of the best players in the world employ Ryu, and watching them play will make even the best Yun and Chun-Li mains doubt their choices. As the genre has grown and evolved, Ryu is a character that is often used to test drive the game before a studied player moves on to the rest of the roster. But Third Strike Ryu is strong. In the right hands, immovable as a mountain, be those hands of gods or children.